Hi, good morning. Shake my hand. Good afternoon. If you're watching this recording at night, good evening. My name is Leroy Maisiri, and I'll be giving you guys a lecture, I guess, or a series of lectures on the 1980s People's Power. All right. This is part of your bigger South African liberation journey that Miss Makwetu has been taking you guys. Just a little bit about myself. I enjoy this subject area, and I really wish we had more time together. But I'm going to use the slots I've been given. I'm only with you guys for about a week. So to build on what I'm about to do today, and probably in the next part of the lecture series, please do the readings somewhere in the reading folder. There's a reading folder there for you, just to help you. I'm always excited when I get to lecture third years because at least there's a common understanding that you read for a degree. You don't do a degree, you don't test for a degree, you don't examine a degree for your undergrad degree, you read for a degree, right? You consume knowledge. And so that's exciting because it means I can then level the conversations at a certain pitch for third years, because you guys are doing the work, you guys are doing the readings, right? So the 1980s People's Power Movement is a very, very important subject to me in terms of research interests. I am by training an industrial sociologist. Industrial economic sociology is really where I come from, but a lover of social history, labor history, all things working class. So fundamentally, if you look at the type of research I've done, what I've published, my masters, etc., all that stuff is really around like a very deep understanding of history, where it's going, what it means. And I really want to take this time, I guess, this opportunity rather, to really shape your understanding of the 1980s, to build on the incredible literature and the work that's been done in the past on this particular subject, but more importantly, to also try and draw some lessons from what we can learn from the past for the future. I mean, right off the bat, I would make a couple of arguments. Number one, a lot of the things that the people in the 1980s were dealing with, we are still dealing with today, right? So if it worked then, it can work now, right? So that's kind of like my position on a lot of this stuff. Number two, I'm always a bit worried about how this type of history was written. Different perspectives push different agendas, and I'm pretty sure as historians, you would know how to deal with that so much more better than I would, right? So I'm going to be talking about the literature. I'm going to be talking about the readings I've chosen for you guys. I'm going to be talking about how to position ourselves around, outside, or even against a patriotic history. I'm going to be highlighting, a history from the bottom, right? Speaking truth to power. And yeah, I mean, please feel free to email, go through the usual channels. If you've got any questions, they will get to me and I'll, promptly deal with them. Right. So, maybe just to quickly introduce a couple of positions before we get started, right? First, I want to maybe propose, right, that we frame the 1980s as a dialectic transition in South Africa, but also I think in the broader framework of world history. All right. So you're going to notice I'm going to keep trying to bring up, a little bit, just a little bit of this dialectic position, what I mean by that. Now, I'm sure you can agree, right, that, and I've sat through all her videos. You guys are so lucky that Miss Makwetu has done a brilliant job, an incredible job in narrating South Africa's liberation struggle, right? That one can actually begin, when I was watching your guys' videos, I was actually also relearning a lot of things. And you can actually begin to notice that she's pointing out some seriously important historical transformations that happened in South Africa. And at each moment, right, not merely a repetition of the same thing. So each era, I think she should phrase them as eras in the course. The segregation era, apartheid era, SACTU era, liberation struggle era, the armed struggle era, etc. And now we're in the 1980s era, right? Each moment is not merely a repetition of the same thing, but rather creating new progressive forms of struggle that, in my argument, led to the 1980s, right? So I really want to make sure that we kind of like keep moving together with the course. we keep linking what Ms. Makwetu has already done, because I think it will have a profound, impact and illuminate, a lot of the main things that I would like us to touch on. All right. So, I mean, as far as this particular lecture is concerned, I'm going to try and keep today's lecture short. It's just to introduce the topic, introduce myself, introduce my pace. I am aware I talk fast. I could explain it to you why, but it will take a lot of time. I'll try and consciously slow down. Half the time I talk fast because I get excited. I get excited when I do the things I love to do. Right. So right from the start, right, I also want to zone into a couple of definitions. And really, the first one I want to deal with, just so that we're all on the same page, is what I mean by liberation, right? What is this South African liberation, versus, for example, democracy? Because, you get to a place where sometimes, especially in the essays, where people will actually mix the two. And when you mix the two, you might run into problems, right? Because we want to really understand what the 1980s people power moment was about. And my argument is it was about a liberation, revolution of sorts, versus what we got, which is democracy of sorts, right? We can debate about these things, man. We can debate about, the types of democracies, the types of liberations. I'm very open to that. But just to kind of like set the stage of where I'm going with this lecture, for me, democracy is basically, stuff that would come with a political culture, that will have a political system and political institutions in place to uphold the culture and the system. All right. So if you think about it, next year is a big year for South Africa. For those of you who vote and believe in voting and believe that's going to change something, right? So there's a political culture, vote for change. There's a system in place for that voting, and there are institutions for all that stuff, political parties, etc., etc. But when we talk about liberation, to me, that's something different, right? Liberation is the impulse embedded in the human psyche. Liberation is this repetitive, pockets of history, the Jacobin moments, right? I mean, you guys are historians, so you would know that, liberation is the the mankind spirit, like really pushing forward for freedom, freedom against oppression, freedom against slavery, freedom against authoritarian rule, etc., etc. Right. So liberation to me is a trans-historical reality, and it takes different forms, right? Different concrete historical manifestations. For example, like the 1980s. If you talk to brilliant Marxist historians, they'll tell you guys about historical materialism, and they'll tell you guys about the stages, right? But I am aware, Ms. Makwetu has made me so aware of how little time I have with you, right? So there's so much I'd love to talk about to frame the 1980s conversation in a broader context, but because of time, and I think 2 lecture slots in this week, etc., I'm gonna sometimes highlight things that I can't get deep into. But remember, the readings are your friends. The readings are your friends. The readings I've chosen for you guys, we'll make sure that everything is covered, right? So now let's just quickly link. Maybe before we get into the 1980s, I've just clarified liberation, democracy. Let's just quickly understand all the hard work that Ms. Makwetu has done so far, so that we can really situate ourselves, right? So if I'm not mistaken, you guys started off with the segregation era, right? And that's like 1910 to 1948, right? And you would know that the segregation era is that consolidation of white power. You've got increasing, discrimination against Black communities. There are many things, that are starting to kind of like, crop up, in South Africa. We've got the Native Land Act, for an example, 1913. But we also see, so while all these things are happening, and that's kind of like how I want you to think, while consolidation of white power is starting to occur, it's the segregation era, the intensification of colonization, and all those kind of things are happening. We also see resistance. We also see, when we talk about a dialect, we talk about 2 things moving at the same time. So we also see the creation or the formation of a Black African organized structures, right? That segregation era, 1910 to 1948, is also the birth, for example, of the ANC. So these things that are coming up in response to that type of oppression. So we see ANC fighting for better living conditions. We see stuff like, the South African Indian Congress, the SAIC, and other, African political organizations, and later as well, we see ICU, right? So, and these are things that Ms. Makwetu's are kind of like touched on. And so I won't be going deep into them. I'm just trying to like quickly walk us through how we got to the 1980s, right? So that's the segregation era, right? And then immediately after that, but it's a continuous flow. Remember these historical moments, continuous flow. We get the apartheid era, right? And the apartheid era is really the establishment of apartheid. So the National Party gains political control. We've got white minority rule, and the suppression intensifies. It continues. It is put into policies that structural racism, the beginnings of racial Fordism or racial capitalism. Everything becomes very much embedded, right, from a base level, but also to a structural level, or all the way to ideological superstructural levels, ideas, laws, everything is really like saturated with this type of, intense racism, segregation, etc., right? So because of that, to maintain that type of oppression, so to speak, we see increased militancy from the state. Like there are so many examples we can get into that Ms. Makwetu has already covered, right? But, just to give an example, right, we've got the Sharpeville massacre, but we also see, a response to all these things once again, that dialectic stuff, right? So we've got the defiance campaign in that particular era that happens. We've got the formulation of the Freedom Charter. These are responses to these things. We've got the rise of non-racialism and Africanism, right? So these ideological principles start to take shape, right? So ideas become a powerful thing. Ideas matter. Historians, you would know this very well, ideas matter. It takes one good idea to get a whole lot of people behind it, and all of a sudden, you've got nationalism, Pan-Africanism, you've got Black consciousness. Ideas matter, right? Because it is the ideas that start to shape identity, right, or class consciousness, so to speak, and they start to move people in different ways, right? So ideas really matter, and we start to see these important ideological principles growing in the midst of oppression. Like I'm reminded by, I think his name was Apollo Ferrer, like, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a brilliant book, and it just highlights this type of dialectic relation that I'm referring to, where there's a lot of oppression, but we must take note of the responses to it. Okay, and then the next era that you guys did with Ms. Makwetu was the SACTU era, right? So this is also, building onto, in middle of the 1950s. I'm sure by 1955 we start to see, SACTU come up, right? So the broader global context at that time is the Cold War, right? So we're halfway in the Cold War. The Cold War is still going on. And that's when we really see the 1960s Sharpeville massacre, right? Which then, directly, at least from the state's perspective, leads to the banning of the ANC and other anti-apartheid organizations. We know there was a lot of death. We know there was a lot of, violence. By the way, the picture in front of you there, that's SACTU in 1958. So they just had one of their annual conferences, and these were some of the delegates, picture that I could find for you guys, right? So, but back to what I was saying. So we've got a lot of banning happening. Anti-apartheid movement, is gaining a lot of momentum. ANC has been banned. Anti-apartheid organizations have been shut down. And SACTU, in the midst of all that, actually achieves a lot of major milestones, right? We've got links like the emergence of the first non-racial trade union movement, right, which becomes such a pillar for worker struggle, right? And we like to call that kind of stuff counter power. It's counter to the oppression. It's a structure that workers use to fight against the existing things that are there, right? So we call that counter power. We see through the SACTU era political unionism, alliances with ANC, but also creation with international links of struggle. We start to see stuff like maritime solidarity taking shape. right? And there's active resuscitation of other unions. I mean, Ms. Makwethu took a lot of time really going through that SACTU stuff. So I always suggest, especially, with you guys doing online learning like this, always go back to your videos, watch them once, twice, 2 times, because there's so much in there. Her videos were so packed with so many great examples. They not only grow SACTU as SACTU, but they also resuscitate unions that were starting to fall off or die down. And then they also go about creating other unions, right? They've got powerful campaigns, organized strikes, and even help create new unions, for workers, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on there. I wrote there for works, but it's really, for workers. Now, SACTU was also very clear, and I found this interesting, right? SACTU was also very clear that for it to achieve genuine transformation of South Africa, it would need to come into conflict with the state, right? So during apartheid, thinking like that, talking like that, acting like that, was something to be amazed by, like something to really. It took a lot of conviction to get there, right? So straight after the SACTU era, then as far as I know, you guys have just finished the armed struggle, right? So we're looking at that time period now between 1963 to 1978, and that's the armed struggle. And here we see a shift, right? We see a shift where a lot of that struggle moves now in terms of armed struggle. So we see the ANC and the anti-apartheid organizations, ANC, PAC, all these organizations began to lean more on armed struggle. The ANC, the armed wing is Umkhonto weSizwe, which is formed in about 1961. You'll double check me. Campaign of sabotage against the state. That's the main thing. Sabotage state apparatuses, assassinations, etc. Another group, like I said, is the PAC, which also was waging armed struggle against the state, right? And it's also, somewhere towards the end of that armed struggle or during the armed struggle is that Steve Biko area, the Black consciousness moment or the movement, right? So all these big ideas are taking shape, and there's also, a shift or slight leaning towards armed struggle, right? Globally, during 1960 to 1978, and I always like to bring this up because nothing happens in a vacuum, and because the world is so linked, right? And our struggles are linked. That's what Marx meant, right? Workers around the world, you have nothing to lose but your chains. There's a big link around a lot of things, right? We've got a couple of things happening outside of South Africa that start to put pressure inside South Africa, and that's important because it has a big impact in the 1980s, right? So we've got sanctions against South Africa, right? A lot of that stuff would be coming from, as a result or as a consequence of the Sharpeville massacre, continuous killings, the existence of apartheid in general. So subsequent capital leaves the country, right? So the apartheid government is actually going broke, right? Overseas investment opportunities become restricted for SA conglomerates, right? And then all of a sudden, there's the 1970s, the golden age of capitalism comes to an end per se. There's a global crisis, right, which ushers in a neoliberal period. You're thinking about Margaret Thatcher, etc. But anyways, this crisis and the oil crisis and all sorts of crises bring their problems all the way to South Africa. Now, there's no time to talk about this, but you can imagine the South African economy is like a closed economy during this time period, right? There's state of emergencies, there's sanctions, there's continuous unrest, there's a lot of things going on. And on top of that, because of how the international community is reacting to South Africa's internal problems, it's a closed economy, right? So closed economy means, you don't really have a lot of global partners, right? So you can't really export a lot of your stuff. Your continuous capitalist profits are reliant on how you do domestically. That you relying on your own national economy. But the problem is, because of apartheid, 80 to 90 or the majority of consumers in South Africa are black, treated badly, highly exploited, taken away from their homeland, paid poorly, which altogether makes them terrible customers. Plus, don't forget, this is when we're going to start to see a lot of boycotts of products, boycott Colgate, boycott this, etc. School disruptions. And it's not like we shut down schools for a week. I'm talking 3 to 4 months. big emergency shutdowns, right? Like there's a whole lot of things going on that actually affect the general flow of a country, right? So basically, at the end of the day, we start to see, eventually South Africa ashes itself into an economic recession with high unemployment, prices going up, etc. All right. So by the time we get to, the 1970s, the 1980s, etc., etc., we really, really, really have a crisis on our hand. And by 1989, and I'll backtrack to our 80s, but I just want you to tie it all together. That's the fall of the Berlin Wall. So for many, that was the signal for the fall of communism, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on that kind of like leads and builds up to this 1980s story, right? So in this first lecture today, I really just want to paint a picture of the 1980s. Now that we understand, what it took for us to get here, I want to paint a picture of this 1980s. But I won't be lecturing you guys and going year by year. 1980 this happened, 1981 this happened. There's no time for that, and I think would actually miss the whole point of what I want us to get to, right? So instead of doing that, what I want to do is I want to give you guys an overview, right? And then in this particular lecture series, could be 2 or 3 videos. We'll see how it goes, with the first one. What I want to do is then give you guys, a better scope, a better focus on people's power, right? So I'm not here to teach you about everything that happened in the 1980s. I would need about a couple of months with you to do that. And I'd love to, believe you me, I would love to. But what I want to do is just to focus on the people's power, right? Not necessarily everything that happened in the 1980s. And I think you will kind of like see why. All right. So this is exactly, what I've just said about the crisis and et cetera, right? So moving on now, like I said, guys, you guys are third years, right? So, when I was asked to be a guest lecturer for the 1980s, I was warned. I was warned that, you guys might not be the most excited group of people about reading. And I just want to quickly address that. Guys, you read for your degree. It's so important. I promise you, you are doing yourself a disservice if you just rely on lecture videos because you think it will help you in multiple choice test questions, because the truth always comes out in your essay writing. You want to write well, you got to read a lot. All right. So I have stuck to what I've been told to do to send the right amount of readings. But just to give you a broader overview for the stuff that I want to talk about with you when it comes to the 1980s, and for the type of literature that I think is very much applicable to the discussions that we're going to have, outside of the few readings I've picked up and chosen for you, I just want to give you a good mapping of literature you should be focusing on the 1980s, right? Once again, you can easily pass, maybe, I don't know, your tests with these videos, but I guarantee you the truth lies in your writing, right? So if your writing isn't doing well, if your essays are terrible or not as where you would like them to be, you got to fix the problem in the reading. You have to interact with a lot of authors' ideas to help shape yours. And then through reading and reading, you will start to learn how to communicate in a writing style. And I'll remind you that Miss Makwethu, because I went through all the videos, started off the term. So your guys' course starts off with how to write. So you can imagine the type of expectations that people now have of the fact that you're third years, you've been taught how to write, and that you guys are responsible students. But yeah, let's quickly just have a look here at what we've got. So this is kind of like the literature that I would like you to focus on, outside of my classes. Thinking about what you guys want to do in the future with your history degrees and your postgraduates, right? So I just want you to kind of like just get a gist of it, right? So definitely, read a lot of, Mike Kiso's work on the 1980s, brilliant stuff. Jacob Dlamini, brilliant guy, got a good book out. Jeremy Sickens, lots and lots of work about the 1980s, about township, base struggles, about how to kind of like look at them. He really has done a lot of work around that. Tom Lodge, Professor Tom Lodge, I must say, and Professor Jeremy Sickens, by the way, Tom Lodge has got this brilliant book that we're going to look into. It's called Black Politics in South Africa since 1945. And in my opinion, he actually creates this template of how to understand what was going on in the townships in the 1980s. So please pick up that book. We've got Martin Murray. Janet Cherry has a lot of work in the 1980s looking at women and how women were almost carelessly written out of the struggle, and she repositions them, right? Into it, which is really cool. Murphy, Hillary, Patrick Bourne, and obviously Kolela. And there's so much more. There's so much more that we're going to talk about. But if you could really, be very familiar with the work of these people, at the very least, I know you will do yourself a favor, right, by making sure that you are completely updated about what it is that I'm talking about. And a lot of the times, when you read and when I talk, and then when you bring those two things together, magic happens, right? So, moving forward now, and I clicked on the wrong thing. Apologies. Right, there we go. Right, so moving forward, and this is that Tom Lodge book I was talking about, right? This is Black Politics in South Africa since 1945 by Tom Lodge. It's a very brilliant book, man. I absolutely recommend you read it, right? But now, what I want to do is to make sure we don't fall into a biased history of the 1980s. That's kind of like the first place I would like to start, where I want to avoid creating the tellings of a patriotic history. And I think the liberation history in general, I'm just saying, in general, when I look at the whole literature, when I'm really thinking about liberation history, it needs a joined up history, right, that gives us due place to township-based rebellions, right? It must honor, there must be like a sacred place that really looks at township-based rebellions in South Africa versus the type of history that you might find in different authors and in different literatures, that they use the township-based rebellions and subordinate it to that of the exiled ANC. That is to say, the history of people's power in the 1980s starts to become read and understood through the lens of the ANC. In such a way, maybe to rephrase that, actually, to say that the people's power movement or struggle happened strictly because of the ANC, or was an arm of the ANC. My position immediately off the bat, before we even start, is to say, well, I want to avoid that. I want to avoid a patriotic history. I want to avoid a biased history. All right. And I really do believe a good starting point to get that clear analysis is this book, right? So Thomas Lodge, in his book, Black Politics in South Africa since 1945. So what it does, very quick summary, because you guys are readers, and I know you're going to go to the library and read the book. Now, I know people be like, no, Leroy, they're third years, they don't read. I know they're lying about you guys. You guys are great. You guys are going to read. Right now, Tom Lodge applied the insights and the techniques of new social history to Sharpeville and the Soweto uprisings. So in the 70s, right? And this book is significant in setting out a model for township studies. One of the earlier works, that I actually enjoy going back to on how to actually view township studies or the township rebellions in a way that does not subordinate them, to that of the exiled ANC, right? So he does a good job there. Right, so I recommend the book because the type of care that Tom Lodge took to situate individual moments and political events within their sociological matrices, right? So there are different contexts in the vow, etc., etc. It's very, very well done, right? So really, my interest then from this understanding that you and I together for this week, we're going to try and step out of patriotic history, will then be to, one of the main things to do is to map out a township historiography, right? Looking and linking transformations in political organizations for, to these upsurges from the below, right? So organically trying to understand, how did people's power start? What was its purpose, and how did it operate from below? All right, and that's very important. But I think to do that, we might have to really, so that you and I are both on the same page. And I don't want you guys to say, well, Leroy, why would we problematize the literature? Well, let's actually first understand what's in there, right? So when I talk about problematizing the literature, I'm really focusing here on this patriotic history that I want us to walk away from, right? So remember, guys, just touch and go today. It's just an introduction. I'm just, laying the scene, testing the waters, and making sure that you also understand me, right? So I'm going to slow down in the next lecture as we unpack all these things, right? But when we talk about problematizing the literature, when looking at the literature, so I'm going to really when you study someone like Jeremy Seekins or Professor Jeremy Seekins accurately, he points out that there are two broad approaches to how the 1980s or the history of the 1980s was written about. Remember, with sociologists, with historians, archaeologists, economists, journalists, right? Everyone was trying to catch up with the happenings of the 1980s. And because a lot of the literature is writing about the 1980s as the 1980s is happening, they don't get, the power of hindsight. They literally are, I think there's an author actually says it feels like this history is being recorded in a rush, and so we want to kind of really when you take a baking syrup and you put flour over it, you want to serve this information up, to get the fine points here. So Seekins came up with a category, really two categories, right? He said, look, man, when you're looking at the 1980s literature, there's really two big categories. There's the structural part and the conspiratory part of the 1980s literature, right? So I'm going to start off with the structural, what he means by that. Here, when we're talking about structural approaches to the 1980s, here the township struggles were read off from the structural context of the political economy, all right? A lot of the literature there viewed the existence of those township rebellions, revolts, strikes, boycotts, etc., as a direct response to political economy. So this meant, less focus on political factors or the role of the national political organizations or leadership structures, but rather looked at things like inflation, the broader capitalist crisis that I was telling you about. I mean, there are these brilliant historical Marxists in South Africa who wrote a lot about this stuff, about the permanent revolution and, CST, colonial for special type, which again, I really wish we had the time to focus on. But, I'm just saying that there's a lot of stuff that was talked about and looked at as a potential reason to why people's power moment happened. And so they looked at the crisis, the impact, they looked at the recession that hit South Africa in 1982. Right? You have to remember, you're right, the first people who will always suffer are at the bottom of the class order, right? The working class. And in South Africa, the majority of the working class was the black working class, and the black working class was originally geographically marginalized to the locations, right, to the townships, etc. So it's not shocking that those were sites of struggle, right? And in those sites of struggle, they had the worst problems, housing shortages, school problems, worker problems, etc., high unemployment, right? Obviously, including a shortage of urban accommodation, okay, in the townships, right? So essentially, that's what the structural angle would look at. And then on the other side, the conspiratory angle, according to Seekins, and I really do agree with a lot of what he says here, is that the township struggles were viewed as an end result of the efforts of the ANC, which was in exile. All right. Yes, there were underground stuff going on. There was armed struggle. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying the conspiracy structure views the township struggles were viewed as an end result of the efforts of the ANC and of that of the South African Communist Party, which, as we all know, was kind of like, one big organization, right? Here, the issue of material grievances and the structural context were downplayed. Right, the ones that I just listed earlier on in the structural column, that was not the main highlight for them. The people who wrote about the 1980s from a conspiratorial perspective, they downplayed all those structural issues. Rather, the point for a lot of them was that the ANC had this massive reach and underground capacity to influence organizations at a grassroots level. All right, so that was their main focus, right? So it was, geez, man, the ANC is doing this from around the world, from exile, from underground, etc., and they've organized the masses, and the masses are responding to an ANC call to render the apartheid government ungovernable, right? So the viewpoint, and this particular viewpoint, by the way, this conspiratory viewpoint, prevailed both within the ANC but also within the National Party. So even the state actually believed that, because remember, the state found the ANC, armed struggle, any anti-apartheid organization as the enemy of the state. And so when the people's power starts to happen, even the state party, you can see it in their national newspapers, keep pushing this agenda that actually these people are doing this because of the ANC. All right, so it becomes tricky when you have literature that's divided like this, about a moment, right? Because it's the structural issues, is it really the conspiratory issues? How do we start to deal with that? And that's why, earlier on, I really, really want you to kind of like focus. It's a pity you guys have already done your essays, but I'd have wanted you guys to really focus on these authors right in front of you, because these are the people who I think best frame, a way forward, right? So when it comes to, the structural approach, the approach that really put a lot of focus on political economy, the literature here focused on these issues, and they looked at the nature of apartheid oppression and the deprivation that existed, right? The capitalist exploitations and all these terrible things that were happening, and they deemed it enough to explain the why. The structure, we understand what's wrong with the conspiratory approach. The conspiratory approach exalts the ANC a bit too much and makes it all about the ANC. It's not all about them, is my argument. But the structural approach is also not perfect, because while it focuses a lot on political economy and on all these things, it actually believes that that's the why. That is the why of the 1980s outbreak, completely ignoring the bigger picture and framing of issues, completely ignoring, a lot of the organic processes that people's power took place, ignoring the forms, ignoring the political culture and the impact of leftist ideology, right? So a lot of that stuff is not examined. It's left unexamined completely in the literature, okay? So that's the bigger problem around the literature. And I hope so far so good and we are together, right? So it in really kind of like fixing a lot of these things and kind of like also supplementing some of the points I've made, I would also highly suggest you look at Professor Alison Drew's work, especially her 2009 publication. I think it's one of her older photos, I'm not entirely sure. But Alison Drew starts off, and she looks at the 1980s, and she correctly, in a big series of work, a massive body. I mean, if you Google Drew's work, it's a lot. There's a lot of this stuff here. That the South African Communist Party and the ANC leadership were working from outside South Africa. This is really more of a fact than a criticism, right? They really were exiled. A lot of their reach was, it was definitely there on the ground, but it was not as impactful as patriotic history would want it to be, right? Primarily, they were actually engaged with trying to find ways to infiltrate South Africa. So in the 1980s, that is also their goal. Their goal is to infiltrate, to come back. But having failed several times, the intention to infiltrate, your MK, cadres in South Africa was to launch the People's War. That was their intention. There's proof of this. So I'm not denying that. They were absolutely hoping to combine armed struggle and mass mobilization, right? I agree with that. They wanted to do that. That was one of their, strategic outlooks, so to speak. But strategy and tactics, because they are different and the linking is important, it didn't actually happen, right? However, the attempts failed. So the attempts to do the People's War, as in to centralize the People's War around ANC, SACP, and to control the People's War and to take leadership of the People's War. That operation failed, and you can trace this. I mean, it goes way back, even before the 1980s, right? Starting with October 1970, there's something called Operation J, which was not successful. MK soldiers ended up being caught and imprisoned, etc. So meanwhile, on the ground in the 1980s, without ANC or SACP to actually, spearhead popular resistance inside of South Africa, it kept growing. So that's point number one. Despite the lack of ANC and South African Communist Party leadership, we see, popular resistance on the ground organically growing, right? And then you've got Professor Nicole Ulrich, who's actually, you guys are lucky, she's in your department. She's actually the Deputy HOD of History, right? If you read her master's thesis, she's got this brilliant master's thesis that she did not so long ago, where she clearly maps out that from 1973, Africa saw the spark of worker struggle. This is all important, guys, because once you understand ideas matter, therefore ideological construction is important, right? It sets the stratosphere, the atmosphere for liberation. Remember, my definition for liberation is that moment in the human psyche, right? So there's something going on that creates the desperate thirst for freedom. And Professor Ulrich mapped this out, like from 1973, Africa saw a spark, right? The spark of worker struggle leading to a new wave of, number one, independent unions, right? Based increasingly on the idea of workers' control of unions, but not just of their workplace, workers' control of unions and society. And this was followed by immediately with an uprising of Black and colored school children, for example, 1976 Soweto uprising, 1977, etc., countrywide, right? So there's this incredible thing happening into the 1970s, definitely into the 1980s, where you start to see popular resistance, this shift of ideas on the ground, a lot of things starting to happen, but we must acknowledge that it is not centralized or controlled by the ANC, right? So that's what I mean by patriotic history, all right? So please check out their work, guys. Alison Drew's work and your Deputy HOD's work, Professor, Ulrich, it's also quite brilliantly clear, right? So all of this became a very clear message that the tides were changing, especially for me. Like I really go, oh, okay, cool. When you look at how Miss Makwetwa's mapped out these eras, segregation era, apartheid era, that SACTU era, then the armed struggle era, times are changing, right? Remember at the very beginning I said, while the moments might seem repetitive, they come back anew, pushing struggle forward. And it's becoming very clear that the tides change, that the masses were starting to organize themselves organically in the 1980s. All right, and I can feel I'm getting excited. And I've messed up my camera, I apologize, right? So the masses are starting to organize themselves. There's a lot of student calls for mass stairways, general strikes, etc. And in 1976, we start to see a lot of these things being eagerly responded to by many workers, right? So collaboration between students and workers and the unemployed, unions involved in community issues, community involved in worker issues, right? And this allowed the struggle, in my opinion, to transition simply from being frustrated and challenging a racial education system to being broadened to challenging the state and all forms of oppression, right? Being jointly addressed by a united working class, both of students, workers, and the general working class of South Africa. All right, so I just want to pause there and really make sure that we're taking this stuff in. So what I'm arguing here is, look, man, during the eras, there are different roles being taken. There are different moments in time, being taken or happening here where we can actually agree on who's in charge or who's leading what. There's the SACTU era, there's the armed struggle era, etc. I agree with all that. But in the 1980s, I am saying this stuff was pretty much led by the masses. Not only that, but the shaping of what their struggle is and why they want to struggle is something slightly new, something slightly different, right? It's a different approach. Towards the end of the 1970s, remember, there was also the Black conscious movement, right, which sets the scene in the 1970s, and it was largely crushed, if you really think about it, around 1976, 1977. Massive state repression, massive state response to Black consciousness. But in the year 1979, right, we see the launch of COSATU. That's one of those progressive unions, okay? And apart from that, the big left traditions present in South Africa at the time, the likes of anarchism, those ideas are the classical Marxism and other left currents begin to emerge. Trotskyism is a big thing. When you go to think about, the education, Cape Town colors, etc. Massive, brilliant, Trotsky analysis there, right? So the point here is a large section of the new trade unions that emerged from the 1970s, right, grouped in COSATU, right, developed a new approach called workerism, okay, which drew on many ideas but stressed, very importantly stressed anti-nationalism or wanted worker-run unions, very much emphasized on a radical bottom-up change, right, that would transfer power from the current structures that exist to the masses. This is absolutely important. So workerism openly distrusted nationalism. Workerism openly distrusted some of the main pillars of the ANC at that time and now. Openly distrusted Marxist-Leninism and was equally disliked by the ANC and South African Communist Party, but was on the ground in the 1980s. Okay, right. So I hope we are together there. Right. So now we can then slightly start to really talk about people's power, because I know I haven't even started to define what it is. All I've been doing is just painting the background, and I really think at some point we're probably going to have to leave it there for today. Just paint the background quite clearly, and then when we come back in the next lecture, we can then start to really tie all this stuff together, right? But just so we can have this to chew on, between now and our next lecture, the People's Power movement in South Africa in the 90s, 80s sought to create new bottom-up forms of governance outside the state. In fact, I would be brave to say sometimes, if not all the time, outside and against the state. It's one thing to do it outside the state. It's another thing to on purposely, as part of your strategy and long-term thinking, as you're trying to transform society, organize outside, so not using the state first, but also against the state. The story of the People's Power movement is read in to tell the story of the People's Power simply answering the calls, right, of the main Black nationalist force. And I've told you guys like many times now, please don't do that. Please don't be the new generation of historians that will view this through a patriotic lens, right? I think we should allow the truth to speak for itself. And that's the main gist and the problem with a lot of the literature. Like it's read as just a response to the calls of the main Black nationalist force, which at the time was the ANC, to make apartheid ungovernable, or to the outburst of frustration of repression. But I believe together we are going to uncover that there was so much more to this. It was more than just a response to the call, right? So, Professor Seekins or Jeremy Seekins actually argued that the consistency in the literature to consider politics as an unrest, just to call it unrest, the strikes again, etc., had a tendency to mean and remain solely focused on exclusively violent protests. So that's another thing that we're not going to do, right? And this was a serious failing to locate people's power and their organs of power into more thorough analysis of township politics or an analysis of the South African political economy. And that's what we are going to do. We're going to do a better job, in this little time that we have together to really understand what was going on. Now, the concept of unrest, just so we're clear, because I don't want anyone to misquote me or to misunderstand me. I apologize if I just hit my mic there. The concept of unrest, right? Common even in the 1980 media coverage when they're talking about unrest in the townships, right? The state may give the impression of capturing the essence of township politics. So whenever they spoke about violent strikes and then the youth are doing this, it may have felt like that was the whole story. And the state at the time loved pushing that type of propaganda. If you read a lot of the journalistic articles of the 1980s, that's all you'll find in there. Okay? But that was not the essence of township politics. In fact, it makes it impossible, if you follow that line of thought, it makes it completely impossible to comprehend the political processes that took place. So I would argue that it actually suggests a false sense of homogeneity that bears very little resemblance, by the way, to the reality of diversity in township politics, diversity in township geographical spaces, diversity in the needs and in the type of struggle that were engaged in different townships at the same time across the country. Very, very important. Very. I hope I'm clear there. If I was in class and I was in a lecture theater, it would be so nice because I'll be looking at your faces and I'll be able to see if there's a light bulb moment or if I've just lost you in a world of confusion, right? So please, once again, feel free to hit us up if I'm not clear, if you don't understand. But I just want to recircle around that, right? So I would argue once again that when you think about the 1980s or this issue of unrest or township violence in that specific limited lens, just classify it as unrest, the same way the state did in the 1980s, what you actually do is you're suggesting a false sense of homogeneity that bears very, very little resemblance, right, to the reality of the diversity in the township politics, and an incoherence that denies the playing out of concrete class interests. That's very important, right? Like most things, the people's power and their organs of power, we're talking about their own structures, but we'll talk about that in the second lecture, right? All those things developed unevenly. All those things had their own issues across the country. But that's the nature of struggle, especially when you are struggling against something that's very uneven, like capitalistic development, right? So people's power and people's power organs are not the same across the country. They're not this homogeneous, well organized in terms of strategy on the ground, structures that they did the same things all the time, right? And I really, really, really want to make sure that when we come back tomorrow, we are very clear on this, or rather in the next lecture, right? So I am not denying, by the way, when I say don't view unrest in that particular lens, this is not me trying to deny that there was violence. No, that's not what I'm saying. There was lots of violence. There was, justified violence, however you understand justified violence, but there was a lot of unjustified violence, however you will understand unjustified violence when you start to interact with the regions. There was lots of violence. I'm not trying to run away from that when I say don't view the unrest in that state. Rather, what I'm saying is there were many other specific and visible forms in which conflict manifested outside of violent protests. These guys built actual things that actually worked, right? Outside the state, outside their local municipalities, outside the violence, they actually did a lot of other things. There were stairways, there were school boycotts, there were transport boycotts, there were consumer boycotts. They did a lot of incredible things and built incredible structures, developed real counter power, right, outside or in addition to the violence that happens right now. The importance of people's power organs lies not in their existence. Okay, it's very important that they existed, but because of how they've been written about, for me, the importance rather lies in the nature of the process of their construction, how people's power was constructed, how those organs of powers existed. And I would like to call that a very specific type of pre-configuration, because if you go back to what they wanted during that liberation moment, we can all agree that they were not crying for democracy or having the rights to vote once every 5 years. They were crying for something completely different, very, very different. Right? So there was a pre-configuration happening at that particular time and it had in itself a very unique nature of process and other types of constructions that I really want us to get into, right? So, Seekins again focused on, in one of his works anyways, on the Vaal, right, for example, right, which is this, the PWV region, right, and noted that the root of the conflict was the nature of the apartheid geography. So there in the Vaal at the particular time, apartheid geography was very important. The physical landscape, where the houses were, the nature and structure of the roads and the railways and the factories, how the workers are placed, urban accommodation and shortages, etc., parks, pavements, schools, sewage systems. The conflict there attacked a lot of things. These built features, these features that I've just listed, built in by apartheid, right? Sorry, if you see me playing with my hair, guys, just because I know my mic is just under my hair. Sorry about that. I should have tied my hair, right? So I just don't want to record and then find out later on, oh my God, the sound wasn't good. That would be very awkward. Right now, these built features were not only a feature of what was not, but arguably what could have been, but also a clear symbol of how the state had failed the working class. That's how they viewed those issues in the Vaal, right? All the physical landscape, the housing, the roads, the railways, the pollution, all these things, it was not simply just about, okay, what's not there, but actually the fact that these things exist to oppress us, right? It is a clear symbol to them that the state didn't care, and more importantly, a signal that the working class had been failed and that they should respond to them, right? Thus, people's power organ here, for example, in the Vaal, right, struggled to redefine the township in terms of use values, right, entailing and it entails this chronic conflict with the state over both the broad political and specific physical relationships concerning the built environment. Like, and this is such a very important example. But and I can go on and on and on and on about the different types of examples and the different types of way for things, right? And maybe just to end, today's, foundation introductory lecture, I can also talk about, Transvaal. Like the Transvaal gave us clear examples of forms of resistance, such as squatting or growing rent areas, and the use of populism, all right, on the part of some candidates for local government election. Right? During this period, mobilization developed as people's perceptions, right, of local councils changed. Remember, the local municipalities, and those local municipalities, local councils belong to the state, right? So that was a big target, right? Active political protest organization and direct action started to emerge, right? So, in terms of introduction lectures, this is really kind of like a slight scope of what I'd like us to get into, right? Moving forward, we'll be getting to like very, very, very specific prime examples, and also getting to much more clear definitions of what people's power is, what it wanted, and how it went about doing that. And then hopefully, if time allows, we can then really talk about these lessons that we can learn from the people's power moment that we can still apply today, because my argument overall is, of course, a lot of the problems that they faced then still exist. We might have gotten rid of apartheid, but we definitely have in 2023 class apartheid. Class apartheid still exists. And so we want to see if there are things that we can extrapolate from the 1980s struggle that we can actually apply concretely into our struggle right now. If you actually believe, like me, that there's a crisis, maybe you don't believe there's a crisis and everything is, going well, maybe Eskom is very normal, I don't know, right? But yeah, I'm looking forward to this journey with you, and looking forward to hearing from you guys. I'm looking forward to hearing about how you're enjoying your readings, because you're reading. I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care. Until next time, peace.